Wonderful. So we are live. We're being recorded. We're here to create some more inspiration and some more insights and some more questions. I'll be talking to you about how far can coaches go. So I did bring a couple of slides, and I want to create conversations. But I do want to show you a few things as well, and I think it's good to have a few visual cues. When we are together, I like talking to people. In this kind of format, I think it's good to have something to focus on your mind on. But I will take regular breaks so we can talk to each other, to raise some questions together. Because what we're talking about here doesn't have one answer. It has a lot of answers, and my goal for this session is that that you will find some of your answers, or at least something shifts, so that you get closer to find your answer to that question of how far coaches can go. So there we go. Let's start. We have 90 minutes for this session. I will talk you through quite a few things, but first of all, I wanted to show you this as an overview. As we know, when we coach, we like to contract a bit. But was it like not to know is a question I always really like asking, because that's very much, Nick started with this existential condition that we're in. What is it like not to know? Particularly in relation to this question of how far can we go as coaches? When does therapy or mentoring or teaching or consulting start? When does coaching end? What are some of these boundaries, the limits to our profession? At what point are we finding ourselves in this gray area? What's it like not to have a clear answer to that? And I just invite you to reflect that. Some of you might know exactly where your line is, and I would love to hear some about that. What I wanted to, first of all, bring out in us is that it's difficult to impossible to know exactly where that line is and how far we can take our coaching practice. And I think it's important that we appreciate that. Even now, when I start with new clients, I always have a conversation about there being a line somewhere, but I can't tell my clients exactly where that is. I can feel it when we approach it, certainly when we overstep it. I have a feeling of, I've just overstepped something. I don't feel competent anymore. I think we are now beyond what I feel willing or able to offer to my client. But I cannot really know when that's going to be. And I think it's a very important skill for us to develop, to be able to be present in the not knowing, to be able to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty, of not knowing who that person in front of us is, or how far exactly we'll be able to take this conversation. So just maybe take a moment to just recognize that feeling. But we can create a little bit of certainty here. And so I do want to give you a little bit of an overview, because what I do want to talk to you about, and what I want us to talk to each other about, and what I want you to talk with yourself about is, what is coaching and where's the line? And when I say coaching, I mean your coaching, because coaching isn't one thing. It's a huge umbrella term for a lot of different practices. So what I want to invite you to think about is, what is coaching for me? Where is that line? So I want to present a couple of definitions of possible models of how we might make sense of coaching, and in that explore where some of these gray areas are, and where some of those lines might be between coaching, therapy, counseling, mentoring, consulting, teaching, just being a good friend. You know, we have all these different roles and hats and spaces that we inhabit as coaches, and there's this huge range of what coaching can be. So that's what I wanted to put on the table today for us to consider. I want to say a few words about ethics as a key component to help us navigate these lines and these spaces, and to find some of our answers to when does coaching end and something else might begin. And I want to offer some guidelines or some ways to not to overstep your line, particularly around supervision and reflective practice, which is, what gathered us together here, to help you think about where those lines are and how might we figure out a way to not overstep that, so that we deliver a good service for our clients and don't put either them or us at risk. And I also want to say a few words about integrative approaches, because they're operating in that gray area. So I'll say a few words more about that, particularly in the context of coaching having evolved into such interesting ways of working with trauma, with bereavement, with addiction. There's a lot of coaching approaches now that operate in areas where you would have traditionally thought that's definitely overstepping a line. But there's good coaching work is possible. So I want to say a few words about that and open that space up. And I have a few resources where you can continue your learning journey if that was interesting to you. I see a thumbs up from Celianne. Thank you so much. You know where those reactions are. I always love when people interact with me. So I have your chat over here. If there's any questions that come to your mind, or any comments or ideas, resources, do drop them in. I have an eye on it. I might not necessarily respond to it, but I think it's good we have that conversation and we follow it. And also, I can see it's that time of the day where there's a reflection in that window, even though that's where the sun goes up, not down. Hey. Okay, so where I'm coming from at this is I've always been interested in the gray area between particularly coaching and therapy. I was ultimately interested in therapy and counseling as I came through psychology, wanting to have deep, meaningful conversations with people about big questions. So I came through positive psychology and coaching. That really, really resonated with me. But I always was interested from my very first days of coaching to work with people across the spectrum of what they can experience as in this human experience. So I was always very naturally interested in where that line is and how can we bring these practices together. I've published quite a few bits and for a very long time have been talking and thinking and practicing in that kind of gray area. I was trained as an existential coach. I did an MA in existential coaching, which for me very naturally was integrative because it was coaching, but the nature of the big existential questions meant that the approach goes quite a lot deeper than a lot of other coaching approaches. So there's some research we've done interviewing ICF master certified coaches about that gray area and how they perceive it. I've been supervising coaches and therapists who integrate that, or coaches who take their practice to quite a deep level. And so that's always been with me, and that's kind of where I'm talking from. I think it's always helpful to learn where somebody is talking from. I invite you to take a moment, what your background is, what made you interested in becoming a coach or working as a supervisor. Because I think that's important in figuring out what drives you into the gray area and how you can frame your space in this helping by talking universe, in this transformational dialogue space. You know, I quite liked it when I heard from Nick the first time the term transformational dialogue. It just connected with me so much because the term coaching always felt a bit restrictive because there are lines that are proposed. Many people try to put a frame around it, and I think that's a good thing, but it also sometimes can feel restrictive because your clients come in with certain assumptions about what that means. Supervisors, trainers, coaching colleagues come in with an assumption about what that means. So that's really where I want to start. If you were to put a frame around your coaching, what would that be? If you have a sentence or a definition for your coaching, if you needed to describe in as few words as possible what coaching is to you, That could be describing it to somebody at a dinner party, or maybe a sentence you put on your website to explain it to your clients. Maybe a term you have on your business card. If you have a few words or a sentence, or even a paragraph you could copy paste or type up quickly, could you put that in the chat for me, or well, for each other, so that we can just appreciate the range of what coaching can be and how we might frame it. A thought untangler. Oh, Claire, I love that. One of my students once told me that they are thought wrangler. And a thought untangler. It rhymes, which just always makes me happy. But that's beautiful because it's very visual, right? We are untangling something that has been mixed up, feels together, but in a way that isn't clear. Helping someone get a new awareness and decide what to do with that new awareness to get the change they want. I love that. Asking open questions to help you reflect, be challenged, and grow. Collaborative thinking. Yeah, thinking partnership is always something that I really appreciated about giving coaching a frame. Ooh, I love that. Born with talent, shaped by culture, stronger with strengths. Space to feel, be, act in freedom. Passionate about working with individuals, facilitating the creation of new insights towards change. I love these. Supporting people to find their way in connecting with self and others. Thank you, Klaus. Partnering in their journey of change. Yeah, that partnering comes up a lot in coaching frameworks. Keep them coming, because that's really what I want you to think about, is to be able to co-pilot. Thank you, Claire. Amazing. Very cool. I love that metaphor of driving, but it works the same in a plane, I think, is that we are not the ones with the wheels in our hands that operate, right? So keep them coming. I want you to take you through a couple of the definitions I found in the literature, in the coaching psychology literature. This is not from the coaching psychology literature, but that's something, I forgot who it was. It was through one of the trainings. Somebody said, coaching is making people's lives better. It's just very simple. And the simplicity of some that coming in through the chat, it's the same thing. It's just, it captures some of the essence of what coaching is about. But then I also think chocolate makes people's lives better. So in terms of a definition, I think there can be more, but it touches on something that's very important. And that's why I think it's helpful that we figure out what the essence of our practice is, of our dialogues. Here's another one that a coaching colleague told me. It's coaching is a powerful conversation that helps you become the best version of yourself. And I also really, really like that because it touches on so many things that coaching is about, to be the best version of ourselves, to grow, to positive psychology, which is one of my theoretical backgrounds. It's very much about optimal human functioning. And much of coaching is just to improve ourselves, to be the best possible version that we can be. So I quite like that. More from the literature is, talking about the range of what coaching can be. This one is from the 90s, about coaching is directly concerned with the immediate improvement of performance and development of skills by a form of tutoring or instruction. And while many of you will hopefully have a reaction to that, it really points to some of the roots of where coaching is coming from, which is sports coaching as a form of tutoring and instruction. When we come into a new practice, it really helps to have somebody with a lot more experience who's an expert in what we're trying to do to show us how it's done and tell us what we're doing wrong. And then we can improve our skills with it. So at one end of the spectrum, coaching can be very much that. And it very much has a place in the learning spectrum. Here's another one by Eitz Downey. Coaching is the art of facilitating the performance, learning, and development of another. Again, very clear, very simple, focused on performance, learning, and development of somebody else. So we're facilitating that. A little bit away from the kind of instruction and tutoring, which can be part of coaching, but for many coaches, they went beyond that. And they actually don't instruct and tutor anymore. They facilitate. Coaching is an outcome-focused activity which seeks to foster self-directed learning through collaborative goal setting, brainstorming, and action planning. So here we're getting more specific about how the coach does this, because a lot of you captured the essence of what we do as coaches, but some of these following definitions, they really focus on how this can be done and what characterizes coaching in terms of what the coach does or how they are relating to their client, how they show up in this relationship. Here, it's collaborative goal setting, brainstorming, and action planning. So very much forward movement, very much focused on goals, but helping somebody think and move forward with this, planning actions with it. Here's a very famous one, which many of you will have come across. Sir John Whitmore: coaching is unlocking a person's potential to maximize their own performance. It's helping them to learn rather than teaching them. So really taking the facilitation to the next level. You want to help somebody learn rather than teach them. So this is not about instruction and tutoring anymore, but it is still to maximize performance. It's about potential. I think that word is very, very powerful. This is by the Association for Coaching, a collaborative, solution-focused, results-oriented, and systematic process in which the coach facilitates the enhancement of work performance, life experience, self-directed learning, and personal growth of the coachee. I love that they bring in life experience here. That wasn't really present so much in much of the organizational coaching, which very much coaching is developed from sports into organizations. Now it branched out into all areas of life. And this definition really captures that and tries to underline that. Human development process, I really like that term, because it's not just about organizational development, it's not just about performance, but it's about human development. Here it highlights that it involves a structured and focused interaction and the use of appropriate strategies, tools, and techniques to promote desirable and sustainable change, not just short-term change, which is more easy to create, but sustainable change for the benefit of the coachee and potentially for other stakeholders. So again, broadening the framework of coaching to not just involve the person, the individual, but also take into account the wider context in which the individual exists and other stakeholders involved, because we never, Peter Hawkins often says, we never just coach the person in the room. You know, we always exist nested in systems, and we need to take into account all the other stakeholders that this coaching client who is in the room with us is going to have an effect on, it's going to influence through our work. Coaching is a process that enables learning and development to occur. To be a successful coach, and I quite like this is why it's in there, requires knowledge and understanding of process, as well as a variety of styles, skills, and techniques that are appropriate to the context in which the coaching takes place. So it's important to appreciate that we coach some different people in different contexts differently, and that a good coach will have a variety of styles, skills, and techniques in their bag. We have a variety of interventions or of approaches. Sometimes we hold space, sometimes we offer a powerful question, sometimes we may go through a structured process to help somebody. But most coaching agreements are quite different. So depending on who we work with, we might be quite a different coach. We might employ different methods or different approaches to coaching. And again, that opens coaching up quite a lot, depending on who you're sitting with. This is by my colleague Christian van Nieuwburg, who says coaching is a one-to-one conversation. So you can have a coaching approach to groups, but for Christian, coaching is one-to-one. It's focused on the enhancement of learning and development. And again, here's a couple of techniques: increasing self-awareness, a sense of personal responsibility. The coach facilitates self-directed learning of the coachee through questioning, active listening, appropriate challenge in a supportive and encouraging climate. So again, more elements of what makes coaching coaching as compared to some of the other conversations and that we might have. Just 2-3 more. This is from the legendary Nick Bolton. I really like this this framework for coaching, a conversation between the coach and coachee or coachees. So notice that this can be done with multiple coachees, in which the coach facilitates a journey of reflective discovery. And I really like the terminology here because it is a journey, and really it is about reflective discovery. We want to invite our clients to reflect so that they can discover, they can learn something. But also it's about decision making and action. So it is moving forward, it is making choices. It is creating action. A defining characteristic of which is the focus on the coachee's own choices, solutions, and agenda. So thank you, Nick, for that. Christian looked at a lot of different coaching definitions and frameworks, and the three themes that he found in most of them is that it's a managed conversation. We're not just talking, we're managing the process of this conversation in one way or another. That takes place between two people. It aims to support sustainable change, so not short-term change, but change that we can actually sustain over a longer period of time, to behaviors or ways of thinking. So coaching in organizations is often seen as a performance change, behavior change. And while that has a lot of value, there's also change we do in ways of thinking and attitude and mindset, which I think often the transformation lies. Behavior can change transformation. We can also go top down from attitude and mindset, which then creates change in behavior. And that most coaching focuses on learning and development. And we've seen that in all of these definitions there. I wrote this one about integrative coaching because I think coaching is necessarily integrative. We always integrate different elements and different approaches, different aspects, different ways of being with somebody or facilitating change. So you will notice a lot of the terminology from other definitions that we've just heard. For me, integrative coaching is a collaborative, managed, and focused conversation in which coach and coachee work in partnership towards progress on an agreed outcome or solution. Usually some form of advancement in learning, awareness, performance, growth, development, or personal and or professional change. The coach facilitates this process through the application and integration of a variety of approaches, styles, skills, and techniques that are appropriate to the context in which the coaching takes place. That's where I'd love to jump into the next set of slides, just to put a couple of models and processes forward. And at the end of that, I would love to encourage you to think about what your own model or process might look like. So let me get into that. At the essence, I think coaching is a journey from A to B. So we are trying to create something. We're trying to go from point A to point B. That's why we often start with what the goal is. And not just a behavior or a specific change, but this also could be who you want to be, not just what you want to do. So we might go there straight, but chances is there's an obstacle, otherwise we wouldn't go see a coach. So we could go find our way around or maybe over. Maybe we dissolve the obstacle so that it's no longer there and we just go to point B. But chances are that the obstacle is too big. Obstacle, I've never said that before. Is too big, and so we need to find another way. So when we start talking about the goal or where's point B, where are you trying to get to? What kind of change are you looking for through this coaching relationship? We can look at what is the deeper goal or the overarching goal. What is the next level be? Because then maybe there's a straight line. Maybe it's not about the weight that somebody is trying to lose. Maybe it's about self-worth or confidence or relationships or finding a partner or having a baby or finding more meaning and purpose in life. I really find it so helpful, and this is one of the major points that most coaches use, is to really spend some time with what does that goal mean to you? Why are you here? Why now? And spend some time talking about that. So we figure out if it's really the presenting issue that they're coming in with, even if they think they know. They might still want to lose the weight to get there. But chances are, there's a journey from A to B. And in essence, that's the kind of process that we often use. And then the journey starts to, how do we get there? And how exactly are we going to do that? And that'll probably ring true to you as the GROW model. right? One of the main models, most popular models, developed by Alexander, but then popularized by Whitmore in the 80s at McKinsey. Fantastic model. Often gets a bad rap for being too performance-oriented and too rigid. But really, how could we not follow that in some way or another? Where do you want to get to? Where are you now? What are the options to bridge that gap? And what exactly and how exactly are you going to do that? What's your way forward? It's genius in its simplicity, and I think it's quite open because that goal could be quite complex and not about behavior at all. So difficult to not have that on your mind in some way or another. But we could also include a lot of other things. This is a very busy slide because it's a very busy model by my colleague Jonathan Passmore. And you will, the ones who are steeped in person-centered counseling, Carl Rogers' work, you will see that the coaching partnership, the relationship on the outside shell of this egg is very much characterized by the core conditions of therapy. Unconditional positive regard, or positive regard here for the coachee, empathy, congruence, being authentic in this relationship, really creating a relationship, and this has been found to be the most important factor for growth in therapy and coaching, is that we create a strong working partnership and that we maintain that partnership by being aware of what's going on for us, by being aware of what's going on for our coachee. And then within that, you find a lot from cognitive behavioral practice, but a lot from many other ways of working. There's some Gestalt in there, there's some psychodynamic in there. There's a lot of elements that come into what's happening within this relationship. And you see here, it's focused on improved performance at work. I would say it's about change. We can just as much create that model to progress towards change, but most of the work that Jonathan does is in organization, so it makes sense that it's focused on that. Is one way of how we could make sense of it. In a very simple way, and again, this is from my colleague Christian von Nieuwenburg, we could look at 3 different factors that play into it. A coaching process, for example, the GROW model, or toolkit, or any of the other coaching practice model by Stephen Palmer, for example. There's a lot of ways in which we can manage a conversation or structure a conversation or a relationship to help somebody move from A to B. That's a coaching process. That's helping somebody go through a process, maybe guide them through, maybe lead them through, maybe just offer it through that conversation. There's different skills that we have, such as summarizing, asking powerful questions, active listening, nonviolent communication. I think you had a session on this earlier. So these are all skills that we can learn in order to be better coaches. The most difficult to learn is a way of being a coach, and that is difficult to define, right? How is a coach? What is a coach like? There's so many different ways of being a coach, but they tend to be open and curious. They tend to be present and grounded. They tend to be committed to a relationship. They tend to be really dedicated to this person who's sitting in front of them and trying to get their ego out of the way and really serve the person in front of them. Some of that is difficult to learn. Some of that we can adopt, but there's certainly something about being a coach that matters. So I quite like that. And then there's Heron's intervention style, which you might have come across. They've been around since the 70s, but I quite like how they open up an awareness of the different ways in which we can meet a client in a relationship. We can be sharing information. We can be challenging and confronting a client. We can be quite prescriptive even. Many coaches bring that into their work. They say, well, this is how you go and focus. Here is an 8-week program for meditation. So that is a valid intervention techniques with lots of value in it, depending on what resonates with the client and what you are willing and able to offer. You can be catalytic, cathartic, supportive. So before I go too much in this, you can see the facilitative and authoritative side of this, helping somebody come to a catharsis and really make connections, have insights, tie up some loose ends in their thinking. It can help create tremendous change. But it's a very different way of intervention than to put some information on the table, or offer an intervention or an exercise or some homework. And again, it's not that one is more valuable than another. It's not that one is more effective than the other, but that we use them when they make sense and when they are appropriate and when they are most likely to help a client. Now, Eric DeHaan has taken these intervention styles and applied them to coaching, so that we have two axes here, the suggesting and exploring axis, and the confronting, the challenging on the left, and the supporting axis. So all of these, depending on where you are very, very helpful. The problem-focused kind of coaching is very helpful. What's the problem and how might we deal with it? What's the weakness and how can we eliminate it or improve it? Most coaching nowadays tends to be more on the solution-focused side. And I say most coaching because probably I'm biased, because I'm very much from the kind of solution-focused, positive psychology, facilitative kind of school of thought. But we can be in that sector and do tremendous work. My modus operandi is probably more on the confronting and the challenging and exploring side. I love to have conversations that create insight. I'm quite person-centered. I like my clients to take the lead. But when I work with coaches, I often share information and I make suggestions, especially if they're just starting out. You know, I had this, when I did my supervision training, I had this image of a rocket going into orbit. Orbit being where things get easier and you're being carried by the gravitational forces that you've put into motion. You know, when we're in orbit, we don't need that kind of fuel anymore. But we need some training and somebody to tell us what those models are and how we could apply them in order to get there, in order to leave Earth and become a coach. So in the beginning, chances are we need some information and we need somebody who might be more authoritative. Maybe somebody who prescribes some exercises, how we could train to be a better coach. So for me, it's about how you frame your space in that helping by talking universe. I wouldn't even call it coaching as such, because the term itself can mean so many different things. So when we look at this model, which I think is quite helpful to have a think about where our space is. Maybe you're here. Like maybe you're naturally quite challenging in your questions. Maybe you love exploring rather than suggesting, and you do some supporting. You're very supportive. You can be a bit of a cheerleader, or you can expand and strengthen what your client already is bringing. But maybe you're on that top right corner, very supportive, lots of advice. That's okay too, as long as you're aware of it, and as long as you communicate that to your client before they pay you, so that they can make an informed decision what kind of coach they're getting involved with. You're trying to figure out through that chemistry call, through that conversation, through that initial consultation, who are you, what would work well for you as a client, what are you after, and then you need to take a look at what do I bring and offer to this relationship and see if that's a good match. So I had a client who wanted to very much that top right corner. And even though my modus operandi was quite at the bottom left, I was happy to offer that because I know that would be useful. And I know I can work like that. It might not be where I naturally would be, but sometimes we do a job and that worked. With time, I think a lot of coaches will develop a much broader frame in this space, so that you can offer to a client what's needed in the specific context that they are. And there might be in a different context at the beginning of a session, at the beginning of a coaching relationship, than at session 5 or session 8. But it's perfectly fine to pick a certain frame and then offer your work in that frame. There's a ton of value there. So again, it's about your client being able to give you informed consent whether to work with you or not. And you might create your own little model. What would be some of the elements that you're bringing? There's 6 in here, but it could also be 3 or 1 or 18. I would really encourage you to try and create your own model of practice and your own definition, your own framework for it, and see how that feels like. See how can you communicate it. So here I just wanted to pause, and I think at this point I would love to get you into breakout groups for about 10 minutes or so, and just give you the opportunity to have a conversation with each other about what might your framework be based on those models. What kind of processes are you using? Where do you see your modus operandi? Perhaps before I do that, I just wanted to show you one more thing. For example, this is the Coaching Behaviors Questionnaire that Eric DeHaan developed for Eschridge Center for Coaching, which is a psychometric based on Heron's intervention styles that can give you an insight into where your preferences lie. You know, it's a beautiful start to a conversation with yourself or with your supervisor or with your coach about where are you. This was mine from a couple of years ago. So you can see where kind of my modus operandi, my strengths are, my natural way of being with people. But then, as I said, sometimes I'm in the prescribing and informing section, depending on whether my client would want that or not. I'm quite happy to give that. I felt I needed to call it something different than coaching or supervision. For me, that's the rocket part, you know. So, but it can help you start a conversation about it. So let's do that. Let's have just 10 minutes of conversations before we talk a little bit about what are some of the differences between coaching and therapy, particularly, and some of those integrative approaches. So I get you into groups of three or four, and so you can have a bit of a conversation and meet each other and get some more of those creative juices flowing. And I'll see you back here in 10 minutes. All right. Welcome back, everybody. It's probably not have been enough time. You could probably talk about this for quite a lot longer. I hope it inspired some conversations, hopefully more questions than answers, but hopefully opened quite a few doors into putting a bit more of a frame around what it is that you do and how you do it. That brings me to my next point, because we already touched on coaching having evolved. There were some excellent points here and comments already. And what I see most often in supervision is that question of, is this still coaching, or are we moving into a therapy territory? Therapy and counseling often being used interchangeably here in the UK. In the US, for example, they're quite different practices. So within counseling and within therapy, there's a similar bandwidth of what it could be and what kind of frame we might put around it. And that kind of reflects in the literature as well, because most people agree that coaches shouldn't offer therapy or counseling. However, many definitions for coaching and counseling are very similar. Baccarova and Cox write that we see coaching as an ally for counseling in the process of improving well-being. Similarly, coaching can look like counseling in disguise, without the stigma, but also without the ethics, because coaching is an unregulated profession, and that comes with many benefits and many pitfalls. So it took me a while to kind of appreciate the complete lack of regulation. There's a number of professional bodies that try to create more frameworks and code of ethics. The AMCC, the ICF, the AC, a couple of other professional bodies do fantastic work into putting more of a frame around what coaching is and maybe isn't. But ultimately, most coaches are not registered or members or accredited with a professional body. And some of that is really good, because there's a lot of people who do fantastic work. But also there's a lot of very rogue practitioners who put their clients at risk. So it's an ongoing conversation whether we need more regulation. In therapy, there's a lot of it, because the clients that come to therapy are characteristically a lot more vulnerable. They're in a more of a sensitive space where you can really do some damage. But more and more coaches also work with clients who are in quite a vulnerable space. And so the idea that I was brought up with as a coach, that coaching clients are resourceful and whole, that there's nothing wrong with them, that nobody is broken, is one that doesn't necessarily apply, but does it? I think it's an important question for you to figure out. How do you see your clients? Even if they're in a really dark spot at the moment, does that mean they're broken or there's something wrong? Do you think there is such a thing as optimal human functioning? Because that would imply that there's a normal. I really like the term neurodiversity when it came around. I think the first time I heard it was maybe 6-8 years ago, because it points to the fact that brains are different, that there's not necessarily a better brain than somebody who's, for example, autistic. So that's a very important question for us to answer for ourselves. How do I relate to this human condition? The existential approach rejects a lot of these labels. If somebody says, I'm OCD, then that doesn't necessarily tell me anything. I mean, it gives me a certain framework that has been defined in the DSM, but really what I'm interested in is, who are you and what does it mean to you? So coming back to coaching and counseling, coaching, I like this quote, coaching is just a different brand name for counseling work. So many of coaches have stepped into the space where they work with clients who would traditionally be referred to a therapist or a counselor. And that an experienced coach may be constantly switching between coaching and counseling, even during a single session. So that brings up the question, well, what is it? Farley and Stout have tried to make sense of this. Where is the role of a coach? And you can see coaching here on the top left, asking questions, and the client is the expert. And on the bottom right, there's the consultant, where you are the expert as the consultant, and you're giving answers. Well, if you ask my brother, who's been a consultant for 10 years, he's not necessarily the expert. He's asking a lot of questions. And yes, some answers are being provided, but very much in the first part of the relationship, you're very much listening. There's very little difference to being a coach, as I had it in my framework. And I really hope that many of you will very much have issues with how coaching is positioned here, particularly far away from mentoring, far away from therapy or counseling or training. Being a manager, facilitator, I would expect more overlap between coaching and facilitation, depending on what a facilitator is to you. When you hear teacher, what do you associate with it? When I hear teacher, a good teacher, I think, will have a coaching hat on quite a lot, depending on the context that the teaching takes place in and what the student wants, requires, needs. So in reality, it looks a lot more like this, depending on who you ask, that coaching can cover quite a lot of these different roles here. I mentioned Eric Dehaan, and in his relational coaching, he puts this graphic forward. Again, quite a busy slide. You can see the type of issues, the levels of interventions between surface and depth. And he kind of leveled where coaching might begin and where some of that overlap might be. So on another level, we can start thinking about where's a good starting point to think about the differences between coaching and therapy. And I think it's really helpful to start making a difference at 3 levels. In themselves, they don't give you an answer. For example, if you regard your clients as resourceful and whole, it's more likely that that's a coaching relationship. Whereas if you were to regard your clients as broken or as suffering, then it's more likely that they enter a therapeutic space. However, there's coaches who work with people who are suffering in a really bad spot, and they do fantastic work. And many clients who are resourceful and whole go to therapy in order to have a structured exploration of depth. So it's a good starting point. It's certainly not an answer in itself. Often you hear, well, coaching is about the present and the future, whereas therapy is mainly in the past and in the present. So again, I know plenty of coaches who listen to how somebody grew up and their dynamics from their childhood. Maybe not at that kind of depth, but very important to acknowledge it and maybe even do some work there. Many therapists, solution-focused therapy we mentioned, is really very much focused on the future and the present and not spending much time in the past at all. So again, a good starting point. There's certainly trends there, but in itself, it's not sufficient. And often coaching is seen as these are surface interventions focused on action, results, and performance, whereas therapy is more often focused on healing, of exploration of self at a level of depth, about transformation of character. But again, transformational coaching has evolved a lot, and a lot of coaches doing formidable work at a deep level, at a level of depth that is really helpful and also often quite healing. Whereas cognitive behavioral therapy is focused on results and creating even better performance, but certainly about taking action towards the future, being different, changing behavior. So these three taken together, they give you certain trends, and they might start to bring an answer out in you, but in itself is difficult to define coaching in general as such, or therapy in general as such. But maybe it helps you to start thinking about where the differences might lie. And I think very importantly, there's a series of research by Lambert and Barley who looked at therapy initially, but McKenna and Davis have translated that into the coaching space as well, is that what mediates the success of our work? And you may have seen that before, but 40%, according to this piece of research, is client factors. They're external. There's nothing you can do about that. You can be the best coach in the world. If somebody's parents die, you're not going to have an effective coaching relationship at that moment in time. So there's client factors that are beyond your control. So that's 40% of what mediates the effect of the work. 30%, which is half of what we can influence, is the relationship. So if we have a solid working alliance, if we have a good relationship, if that client feels open and confident in the relationship, and they feel they can open up and they trust you, that's half of what you can affect as a coach and as a therapist. So that's really quite important. If we get that right, we got half of it done. The other 15% and 15%, which is a quarter and a quarter of what we can influence, is expectations and hope. If you charge a lot of money and your client thinks you are the best coach possible for them, they're going to have better results just because they believe it's going to help them. So if somebody believes that this is going to be helpful, it's much more likely that it's going to be helpful. And only the last quarter is to do with the actual questions that you're asking, the school of thought that you're coming in from, the process that you're using, or the theoretical orientation that you've been trained in. So a lot of coaches really focus on what next tool can I use? What's the next powerful question? When actually it's less likely to be as effective as you think it might be. What's most important is that you create a space for the client where they feel safe and where they can do their work. And then we talk about integration. We've said a few words already about where this is in the gray area now. This is where we combine different elements. And there's lots out there, from deep coaching, trauma-informed coaching, or even coaching that works to heal trauma. The first time I heard about bereavement coaching, I was shocked. I thought that can't possibly be ethical. That can't possibly be a helpful tool for somebody who's just lost a loved one. And I talked to a few. I wrote something in the newsletter, and I got quite a few bereavement coaches reaching out to me, and we entered some really creative dialogue. It was fantastic. It was a really good learning experience because my views really changed in those conversations. Because there are ways in which coaching can help, either in parallel to therapy and counseling, but also depending on where their client is and what their context is and what their relationship with bereavement is and what that person meant to them. Coaching work can be possible, even though I still believe that it's probably not the best tool. If I know somebody who's bereaved and they're looking for help, I would probably not send them to a bereavement coach, but to a counselor. But still, work is possible there. There's coaching now in the addiction space, spiritual coaching, existential coaching, integrative coaching, therapeutic coaching. Well, what is life coaching? Most life coaches draw on therapeutic techniques. TA, transactional analysis, came from therapy. It's a Freudian concept that got modelified, is that a word? Well, made more simple and understandable, and it's adding so much value to coaches, but it's initially coming from therapy. So it's difficult not to use elements of therapy when we coach. And that just means that the gray areas became more profound. So we can think about therapy creating the foundation and then coaching building the house, and that we need to do a bit of both. But really, a lot of coaches work on your foundations, and many therapists work on your house in that sense. We can also ask ourselves, how does the process work? We could do it. This is from my colleague Nash Popovich. He says, well, you can use integration as a tequila slammer. You do some counseling, and then you do some coaching, and then you do some therapy on top of that. You can switch back and forth between modalities. Well, my integrative practice is more like a gin and tonic. We put it all together and we mix it and it becomes a blend. And we might not necessarily say, oh, right now I'm putting my mentoring hat on, or right now I'm putting my training hat on, right now I'm switching back to coaching, even though the ICF would probably want you to do that, otherwise you don't pass the accreditation. But what's most helpful to the client? And that's helpful for us to think about. How do we blend it if we do blend? And I think it's almost impossible not to blend some elements. But depending on what terminology you're using and what you're mixing together, have a little think about what would be most helpful for the client. Because many clients will appreciate it that now we do this and then we do the next stage. Some clients really appreciate it to say, okay, let's talk about the goal. And now we're finished talking about a goal. Let's go talk about your reality. Where are you now? And they really appreciate that structure and that process, and it helps them learn because that structure keeps them safe. I like my work to feel like a fluid, organic conversation, even though there's a process operating in the background. I like that. But if I meet a client who really wants a lot of structure, probably refer them to a coach who loves working in that way, because that will help that client most. So think about where your approach lies and how do you like to work. And really, the key ingredient here is ethics when you try to navigate that space, when you navigate your framework. And by ethics, I don't mean a code of conduct, a set of rules that you need to follow. By ethics, I mean an ongoing process of reflection, a set of questions you ask yourself on an ongoing basis that will help you make ethical decisions when you're at certain crossroads. And they're all the time there. There's so many ethical choices we make every single day, and there's hundreds that we probably make during a single coaching engagement, if we pay attention to them. So that's why reflective practice is so important. How can we not overstep one of our lines? How can we continue to work within our frame that we've set? And some things can help, like codes of conduct, for example, rules, laws of the land, guidelines, your values, your belief systems, assumptions that you're making about what coaching is or isn't, your moral framework for what's right and wrong. No? But what's important is that you ask yourself questions, or that you're being asked questions by, for example, a supervisor or a peer, or by a set of questions you wrote down and you look at after a session, that you ask yourself these questions, followed by honest and critical evaluation of these questions. And all these are factors that play into that. And I think they're very important to consider, and they're very easy to forget. So I encourage everybody to make that space after ideally every single coaching session that you do, and ask yourself some questions. Sit there and reflect on it. I really like the quote, I forgot who was for, that we think at a quarter, we speak at a quarter of reading speed, we write at a quarter of speaking speed, and when we reflect, we furthermore slow down that process. So the supervision space, or any reflective space that we create, you really want to slow right down and consider what's happened here between me and my client. We can ask ourselves questions about what has been going on, what assumptions have I been making, how does that align with perhaps the ethical framework of our professional body? What else might have been happening? Were there any moments that stuck out? What did the bottom left corner of my stomach had to say? Was I so involved that I didn't pay attention to it? What if I pay attention to it now? Were there any lines that were approached or crossed? Is there something that I should be careful about as I move forward? The main questions here that very, very often I come back to is, am I willing to work with this client? And am I able to work with this client? Am I providing the best service possible here? Willing and able are very important. I might be willing to work with a client because I really want to help them, but I might not have the appropriate tools or experience to help a client with what they're bringing. Or the other way around. One of my first coaching trainers, Jamie Reed, he was trained as a psychotherapist, but he just chose to not do that work anymore. So in his executive coaching work, if something came up that would be much better placed than therapy, he would refer it. Even though he was able to work with that, he wasn't willing anymore. And that's okay. We don't have to continue working with a client if we just don't want to. So 2 important questions. And, ultimately it's what serves my clients best. So I don't like rules. I'm quite a rebel, so I'm not sure why I chose that terminology particularly, but I guess it sounds quite nice. Maybe guidelines, invitations, perhaps. But here are 8 elements that I would invite you to consider. First one is the ethical principles. Have you thought about that? Have you written some of them down? What lies at the essence of your coaching practice? What is important to you? What matters in terms of morals and ethics? What's right and wrong? What lies at the center of your practice? Clear contracting and framing your space, being able to communicate what it is that you do and what it is that you don't do for your clients. Being transparent in communicating that. I mentioned that it's important your client can give you informed consent, and they can only do that if you inform them well about what they're getting themselves into when they work with you. Knowing your boundaries, having thought about your space and what might lie outside, and how would you notice that you approached one of these boundaries. Staying mindful, being really present, knowing what the signs are of you approaching one of those lines and what you would do then. But we can only do that when we stay mindful, when we stay present, when we learn to listen to the signs, when we learn to notice the sensations. For me, I talked about the bottom left part of my stomach. That's where I feel that very often. Others might feel it in their forehead or in their shoulders or in their back. Where do you feel that? It takes courage to raise concerns or to refer a client, because we don't want to reject somebody. We don't want to make somebody feel awkward or feel broken or feel like they're not, that they don't do it right. They're not being a good client. So it can take some courage to have the conversation. But when we switch that mindset to, I want you to get the best help possible, and that's why I'm having the conversation, you're doing a client a disservice if you try to work with them beyond your capacity, beyond your competency. And regular reflective practice, which ideally, I think, includes supervision, but any reflective space can be under the shower, can be the 5-10 minutes you take to take notes. It can be a regular peer supervision group, or just sitting there and meditating every evening on the coaching clients you used to work with today. Any form of reflective practice works, and I think supervision is the crown of the reflective practices, because the supervisor will be professionally trained to help you reflect. So in that sense, supervision is somewhere between super useful and you absolutely should. And I use the word should here very consciously, because depending on who you work with, and we mentioned some of the clients who are in a really vulnerable spot, you absolutely should, I think. I did some work in the coaching and psychedelics sector, trying to figure out how these 2 practices could work together, given all the incredible research on psychedelics helping various conditions around depression and post-traumatic stress. But there's coaches operating in that space, and I think they can absolutely provide value, but they absolutely should be in supervision. That's something I'm putting out there quite strongly, and that many coaches don't like to hear. And then what is a supervisor? That's important to put a framework around. I'm happy to share those slides with you, but there's plenty of ways to find a supervisor. And the one I wanted to point out, other than, just Google it, most of the professional bodies will have a directory, but the ICCS, the International Center for Coaching Supervision, has a fantastic directory for supervisors. And if you're looking for one, go get one. If you've been waiting for it, what are you waiting for? There's plenty of supervisors in training who give you a really fair rate. Enter a reflective space. It's going to help you and your clients. It's just such a good thing to do. You're going to grow as a coach. your clients are going to be in a much better place. I just can't recommend it enough. That's me, really. If you want to continue that learning journey, there's a couple of resources here. Particularly, I mentioned personal consultancy, bringing coaching and therapy together. There's a few people who talked about the gray area and how we might continue that conversation about how to navigate that space. That piece of research I mentioned with Carly Syme about where we interviewed the ICF MCCs about how they experienced the gray space, that's there. And also I mentioned the CBQ, the Coaching Behaviors Questionnaire, and there's also one for Heron's intervention styles. So if you wanted the slide, I sent the slide to Kat. Maybe we can, I think she can post it in the forum. But feel free to contact me. I'm happy to send you stuff. I write some stuff. I used to say monthly. I got a bit slacky about it. But if you wanted to stay in touch, that's a good way to do so. And thank you very much for engaging and being here with me. And I'll probably stick my head into the networking space as well. So see you over there.